For this one, I want to talk a little bit about the film industry. Obviously, in 2020, with the coronavirus pandemic, the whole industry's been massively impacted, as has everything else. I mean, my local cinema hasn't been open for about 6 months now. I know they're scheduled to be getting back on track, but periodically I look at the website and they still haven't announced a sort of date for that. Um, I imagine a lot of films are going to be in a sort of almost queue type situation. So all the films due for 2020 release, I imagine there's going to be some difficult decisions made by cinema chains as to what gets screened and what doesn't. So no doubt the film industry's been heavily impacted by this. So perhaps it's a good time to actually make some thoughts and comments on the film industry today. Now, this is not going to be looking at the issues around socio politics. I've covered that in other videos, and I think there's a lot of, I believe that the film industry has absolutely been, um, let's say, impacted by the culture wars in recent years. But I've already covered that, and I don't want to go into huge details about that. But suffice to say, I think that there has been a lot of pressure and influence on the film industry to be um, certainly diverse, but I think also on some level, I think it's went too far. I think it's definitely been almost hijacked by the divisive narrative of identity politics. And I know that would be controversial to say, but I think it's true. But anyway, I've covered that in other videos. For this video, what I want to focus on is more technical side of things about cinematography. Now, just a disclaimer here, I'm not a cinematography student. I can't claim to, have studied this subject in great depth. However, I am a film lover. Um, I may have around 1,000 DVDs, literally, um, at least approaching 1,000. So I'm a lover of film, you know, and they range greatly, crossing almost pretty much every genre. Um, I've just watched the film Crash of the Titans from 1981, which is based on the Greek legend of Perseus. Um, and I think that would be a good example to look at because it was remade in 2010. The 1981 version, I wouldn't go so far as to say it was critically acclaimed, but it got quite good. It got quite a good reception. The 2010 version, as I understand, was panned. Now, I haven't seen the 2010 version, but obviously I've just watched the 1981 version. And there's a famous scene, as with the legend, in which Perseus takes the head of the Gorgon Medusa, this kind of half woman, half serpent creature. And he can't look at her directly because if she looks at any man, any warrior, he will be turned to stone. So it's a very important part of the legend. And I decided to just compare the two scenes. I've just watched the scene directly from the television screen of the 1981 version. And it's very atmospheric and well done. The actor playing Perseus, I believe, he's not really a household name, but the guy was called, let me just get this right, Harry Hamlin. I thought he carried that very well, and it had quite a big cast. It had Maggie Smith, Ursula Andress, Laurence Olivier as Zeus, and Burgess Meredith in the role of the sort of elderly poet. Um, just catching up on my Greek legends here. The poet is goes by the name of bear with me a second. Ammon, yes. So that's a very different role for Burgess Meredith. I knew him from the Rocky series, of course, as Mickey Goldmill, Rocky's trainer. And this is a lot gentler, a lot very different role, but shows what a fine actor he was. Um, but it's worth comparing these two scenes. So I watched the scene from the 2010 version. First, the Medusa is far more human-like, I mean, she's got the face of an attractive woman, but she still has all the snakes in her hair. Whereas the 1981 version is more like a sort of demonic type figure, very, very ugly, very physically ugly, and more monstrous. So that's probably just an artistic decision. Um, the 2010 version was quite impressive, but that's kind of what I want to talk about, the increasing use of CGI in film. To give another example, I watched, I wouldn't call myself a huge Doctor Who fan, but if you look at clips from the old run of Doctor Who, that is from, let's say, the William Hartnell era of 1963, this is people who, will follow Doctor Who will obviously be familiar with this. The first Doctor to was it seventh Doctor, Sylvester McCoy. That's generally seen as the old Doctor Who, the first run from 1963 to 1996, roughly speaking. Um, I'd always been familiar with the old Doctor Who, sort of. I was never a massive fan, but I'd always been familiar with it. Um, and if you compare the sort of special effects and the monsters of the old era to the new era, there's definitely a difference. I find from the David Tennant era onwards, um, there's a real polished effect. Um, Obviously, you have to look at things like the BBC is working with a different budget. For example, I looked at one storyline from 1973, and it showed John Pertwee's Doctor, the third Doctor, um, chasing around a dinosaur, Tyrannosaurus Rex, and his assistant Sarah Jane, excuse me, is running away from it. Now, there's no question about it. The T Rex looks like a child's toy. It is very rudimentary. However, as was pointed out, you have to allow for the fact that we're working on a BBC budget and they had no CGI. Also, given that it's a television show and not a feature film, they're going to have a lower budget. So although the dinosaur looked pretty fake, it still had an atmosphere about it. And Who fans say that that was actually a good storyline. I wouldn't know. I don't know. I don't follow Doctor Who enough to know about storylines or anything like that. But if that was a Doctor Who story of today, the CGI would be great. The effects would be great. But I sometimes wonder, is there over reliance on CGI? Obviously, for certain genres, for science fiction, for fantasy films, and certainly Marvel comic films, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Um, like you need special effects as part of it, but I sometimes wonder, do people almost have a nostalgic liking for the more basic, older version of things, where it's far more obviously like a prop, a robotic device, or I'm not sure what sort of technology they would have used, but there's almost something about the creative side of that that's more appealing, even though it's less convincing. It's a very strange phenomenon. It's almost like a nostalgic look at things, cinema and television, for that matter, from the past. And there's other examples of this. I mean, as a child, my favorite story was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And to give two examples of that, there's been many adaptations, but the two I'm most familiar with is the 1988 BBC version and the Walden Media Disney version from 2005. Now, I like both, just for the record. I'm very fond of both. But the 1988 version, the lion is clearly an animatronic sort of robot. The beavers, Mr. and Mrs. Beavers, are blatantly people in suits. So it's very stagey. It's very, clearly BBC props. However, it still has a certain charm, and I grew up with that series. I loved it. Now, the Disney version, great special effects, and it still has a magical aspect to it. But here's the thing. If you look at productions from the mid 2000s, or maybe late 2000s and today, there really isn't much difference. I don't know if the technology has improved that much, and I might be wrong about this. I feel that, it's hard to contextualize films even from 15 years ago because they look like films today. Whereas if you watch a film from 1981, as I just have, you know it's from 1981, and there's something about that that's almost appealing. You can contextualize it, for want of a better term. So I'm not so sure that always trying to go for the best special effects is the best approach to cinematography. Of course, you need good acting, you need a good story. I sometimes wonder, is cinema today a little bit too polished in some way? It's hard to explain, but I mean, I wouldn't suggest, of course, it would be absurd to say, oh, cinema makers or filmmakers should try and be more rustic or more less polished. So there are certain directors who certainly have nods to a retro feel of things. Quentin Tarantino is one. There's others where they sort of in their filmmaking they have a certain retro feel, even within the recent films. I mean, with Tarantino's films, you have that those sort of yellow credits in the opening scenes, and there's definitely, that's definitely sort of got a retro feel about it. Yet they're still modern films. I mean, they're made when they're made. He's not trying to just copy old films. They still have, you know, other aspects that put them as modern films, but they have that retro feel as well. So that brings me to the whole Marvel Comics thing. I have to be honest, I've never been into it. I just I can't get emotionally invested with fantasy films. I mean, that wouldn't be my go-to genre of choice. My go-to genre of choice is probably epic historic films, or historic epics rather, where there's real history involved, or at least based on real history. Most historic films have some mistakes or some artistic license, but at least based on real history. Even sword and sandal biblical epics, most historians concede there is some historiosity to faith-based films, not necessarily the divine intervention and all that, but certainly ancient civilizations and sword and sandal epics like the Ten Commandments or Spartacus have some historic basis. But I've always found films that are, great epics, um, needs no introduction. Titanic, even less acclaimed films like Pompeii 2014, where there's a human story with history, that's always appealing to me. Gangs of New York is one of my favorite films, um, because I get very moved by the human story of that. I'm not talking about the fictional characters. I'm talking about the fact that that's based on real real lives. It's based on sort of ethnic and social tensions that came from the different immigrant communities, but also the New York draft riots of 1863. And there's a sort of something about that I've always found very moving. History-based films, even ones that have mistakes, because I love history. I've always loved history. I've found it's our human story, So something like that is always going to move me more than something like Star Wars. I know Star Wars fans get very passionate. I I could never be as emotionally invested in a film like Star Wars as I would with a film based on real history. It's not to say that's not a swipe at Star Wars. It's a great cinematic achievement, but I always find the films that move me most are those that, Schindler's List, even Gone with the Wind, which is controversial. Any film that has somewhat based on history will move me in some way, although of course there's variations there. Now, of course, historic films are still being made, and in the 2010s we saw a big prevalence of race-based films. So Selma, 12 Years a Slave, Harriet, Butler, um, Hidden Figures. There were a lot of films that were based around race in America, um, hitting the decade in some ways. And so there's still films with that historic focus, and long may they continue, because I think that I'm a strong believer that film can bring history to the popular imagination, or rather popular interest. And I know historians get you know, um, a bit precious about this, insofar as they can be a little bit cantankerous, actually, if something is not 100% accurate. But I think for their part, historians need to remember that the primary job of a filmmaker is entertainment. Um, and I think they kind of need to respect that. So it's not going to be 100% accurate. I mean, I know I watched Stephen Hawking biopic yesterday, The Theory of Everything, and apparently some physicists and some people in the science world who knew the professor that tutored Stephen Hawking were critical of his portrayal. So you get perfectionists who are very I mean, I don't agree with that. I don't think David Thewlis showed that professor, I forget his name now, in a negative light at all. Um, so, critics need to remember that film fundamentally has to take some artistic license, because almost entertainment. That needs to be understood. But anyway, yeah, the whole Marvel Comics thing, I know Martin Scorsese's been very critical of this. He said it's not cinema. Maybe that criticism's a little bit harsh, but I do know what he means. I think it's becoming too dominant in the film industry, and it's taken away human interest stories now. It's undeniable. Clearly, those films have enormous popular appeal. I mean, they are the highest grossing films ever. And it seems now that, whereas in the 20th century, the really, really big films, Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, Titanic, they stood the test of time, and they would stand alone for a long time in terms of the box office. But now we're seeing films breaking that $1 billion threshold pretty much every year. And that makes me think, well, are these films really going to be remembered? Or are they just kind of, it's almost like the industry is getting too big for its own good. In the 20th century, it was a studio system that was very powerful. Now it's actually almost like the genre of Marvel comics is, I mean, its power is incredible within the industry. And I can't just denounce it and say, oh, it's whatever, because I haven't seen enough of those films to really, I mean, I don't think I'd be interested in it, because I cannot. It's very fantasy focused. It's very, it's all about superpowers, and I just don't think I could ever get as emotionally invested in the characters. Now, people might say, "Oh, well, you've just watched a fantasy film," but the point there is Clash of the Titans is based on ancient Greek mythology. So it's part of human civilization, human culture. With Marvel comics, they're all some of the older ones like Batman and Superman I'd be a bit more interested in, because, those comics are over 80 years old, and I'm broadly familiar with the story, but I'm still not a massive fan of the whole genre. I always like Batman Returns. I think Danny DeVito was superb as the Penguin. I personally think that was better than the 1989 Batman, and I've seen both. Because I just think Danny DeVito was um, he was the Penguin. It was just incredible. His performance was incredible. But I think those two things, the prevalence of CGI and that sort of film is so dominant in the industry these days. It's kind of pushing aside pure acting and human-based dramas. And I mean, people are going to be. The thing is, the industry is dictated by popular interest, right? And that's the way it is. It's the way it's always been. But I do hope we never get a situation where the industry is totally taken over by CGI and nothing is real anymore. In other words, just actors acting. Certainly, people coming from the Shakespearean, or let's say, stage side of things, I imagine, would be quite critical of this world. But I suppose you could say that the industry's always been subject to change. I mean, if we look at the two eras of Disney, so for example, the Disney Renaissance of the 90s, I grew up with stuff like that, like the revival of Beauty and the Beast and films like that. Um, you know, they were kind of a very different world from the sort of motion capture that we get today. But most people, I think, compared the 1991 Beauty and the Beast to the 2017 Beauty and the Beast. And I think there's a reason for that. There's something about certain older films that just have more of a magic to them, precisely because they were a little bit rough around the edges, or I don't know, it's hard to explain. Um, but I do sometimes wonder, are contemporary films too polished? And also, is there too much of a focus on special effects? I mean, we see this in horror films. One reason I am not impressed by many horror films today is, I mean, for one thing, the trailers just give away half the film. I don't know what it is with the horror genre, but the whole concept of suspense has been thrown out the window. Occasionally, you get good ones. I mean, Orphan from Leonardo DiCaprio's studio or his production company, that was a genuinely scary film. So occasionally that still has an effect. However, I think most modern horrors are one of two things. They're either working too hard on CGI and they go straight into the shock factor and they just try to overdo it in the special effects, or they're just torture porn, like they're just gratuitously violent. Um, I'll give an example of this 1408 with John Cusack. That started off well. I liked the first half of the film. I thought it had good suspense, some good jumpy moments. It was a good story. But for me, they just went way over the top on the special effects. You know, to the point where the room was like totally flooded and the bed was coming to life, and it went way over the top. So I think that was my phone running low on battery. So I think definitely special effects can be overused. I wouldn't dismiss it as a technology. Obviously, I can't dismiss special effects. Special effects was used in my favorite films, but I do think that it can be overused. And I know what Martin Scorsese meant in his criticism. I'm not bashing Marvel Comics. Clearly, there's an interest there. I'm not really interested in it. I can appreciate. I've seen clips of those films, so I can appreciate that they look impressive. But personally, I don't think I would be emotionally invested in the story. Point one, and point two, I think they're almost entirely based on special effects. So the acting is, I don't know. I mean, I guess if an actor's got all the prosthetics on, then you know, what extent is the acting important versus, the visual appearance? And I'm not bashing the actors, by the way. I don't want anyone to think that, but I am maybe a bit old school. I do appreciate just pure acting. And I do think that there can be too much of focus on special effects these days. I just hope the industry doesn't become so consumed by it that I mean, I have to say, Lego the movie, I'm sorry, but I do, to me, that's how a film based on Lego bricks, to me, that just seems like a dumbing down of creativity. Now, I haven't seen the film, maybe I'm being too critical, but you cannot tell me that something like that could ever have the creative or human interest appeal of something like Gangs of New York or any host of other films. And I'm not just talking about history films, by the way. There's thrillers, there's dramas, romances, mob films, westerns. They're still being made, they're still out there. Another thing, and I'll close this soon because I'm on 24 minutes. I'm very concerned about the influence of Netflix, and I'm not a fan of it. I don't like this idea that um, I mean, you pay like a contract, as I understand, and then you get so many films Like you have a certain period to watch them, 3 months or whatever it is, and I think it would be an utter tragedy if cinema, I mean the big screen, if that ever declined, that would be an utter tragedy. There's already far fewer cinemas than there were in the 1960s. I mean, in my city, for example, in Sunderland, back then, I think the city had something like a dozen cinemas, and that was typical. Today we have one. I sincerely hope this pandemic doesn't affect cinema. I mean, long term. Um, and it would be a total tragedy if Netflix took over cinema because there's a lot of films that I'm not criticizing the quality of Netflix films. Some of them look very interesting, but it's the fact that you can only get them on Netflix. So that immediately takes away that big screen magic, and that's a competitor to cinema. So I don't like it. At least I have a cynical vibe about it. I could be wrong. Maybe 10 years from now I'll be converted, but I don't think you can ever beat the magic of the big screen. I just think I don't think it can be done. And CGI can be wonderful. I'm not totally dismissing it. I accept that it can definitely have an impressive effect, but I also think there needs to be something in depth of pure acting, pure human stories, pure, creativity. Because I also am tempted to think that CGI, I don't want to say it's lazy because I'm sure filmmakers work very hard, but I know that when it first came in, traditional cartoonists felt their positions were threatened. So I don't know, the industry always changes, but I am a bit old school and I think there needs to be an appreciation for old cinema. Finally, I'm not saying like, some old films that are scrappy and they are very archaic and barely watchable, and some new films that are very impressive. But I'm not convinced that all the changes are for the better, and I am a fan of some of older cinema as well. Let me know your thoughts.